Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of KN Talks. I'm delighted to be joined today by Victoria Ansell, who works at Marktlink, the corporate finance house. Victoria's kindly agreed to talk to us today about things that you might want to think about if you're considering selling your business. The preparation process being incredibly important in making sure that you have the best value and the easiest sale process, which can be quite onerous. Victoria, welcome to the podcast. Thank you. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about Marktlink to start off.
Of course. Morning, John. Thanks ever so much for inviting me to join you here. It's great. So Marktlink is an M&A boutique, lead advisory. So we support entrepreneurs, family-owned and founder-led businesses on buy-side, sell-side and fundraising transactions. We sit in what's called the lower mid-market. So we're working with businesses, say, from 1 to 10 million of profits across all sectors. So it's always interesting. It's always different. Every client is different, their businesses are different, and importantly, their objectives and their aspirations are different. And the critical thing that we like to try and do is get under the bonnet of what are they seeking to achieve, and then really drive a process around that. So it's tailored to the outcomes that they're really seeking, not just in the near term, but for the longer term as well.
Excellent. So I'm an entrepreneur in your space, a 1 to 10 million pound profit business, and I'm thinking about selling. Probably it's just a vague thought at this stage. Where should I start when I'm thinking about an exit?
Start with a conversation, asking who might be able to support you, what do you need to know, and also asking yourself, why? Why am I looking to sell? Working with entrepreneurs, so much of the time, the drivers for a transaction are very personally driven. They're driven by life and what it throws at you. But it's really important to explore for oneself that why, that rationalization. You can talk to advisors because it's that will drive how a transaction should be approached, timeframes, how it's structured, all of those things which should be created around really what you are driving at and what you're seeking to achieve. There are so many moving parts, and having buy-in from other members of your family, particularly your spouse, because if you're going through a process, having that support and them being on board with the process is really useful. Having the management team's thoughts as well. If you talk to them at that very early stage, you might not, but understanding or at least considering where their heads might be at is a good thing. That will drive towards what we call the buyer universe. So when we're starting to explore a transaction and we're exploring who might be an interested party for your business, we look at different buyer pools, and those pools that we explore in that buyer universe will depend on what kind of transaction are you seeking, what outcome do you want from it, because it'll be different if you want a complete exit where you can simply step away on day one and walk away, to if you want what we call sometimes a pre-exit. You sell a stake to an investor, private equity, but you're happy to stick around for another few years before you realise further value, or you want to create a succession plan that passes it on to the next generation, your management team, your children, or if you're looking at the EOT framework, what are the thoughts behind these things? Because they will all drive the potential for different kinds of transaction.
And I guess it can be many things. It's not just necessarily the money. It can also be the long-term future of the business. It can be that family passing it down while making sure that you realise some value to support you for retirement. It can even be selling a stake to bring in, I guess, a strategic investor to help you grow the business so that you may have a smaller slice of the pie, but it's a lot bigger pie by the time you come to one of those full exits.
Exactly that. Price is only one aspect of a transaction. It's obviously a really important one, but it might not be the most important one. And it certainly shouldn't be looking at price to the exclusion of all other considerations. Having in mind what your valuation expectations might be is fundamentally important. Because if you talk to an advisor and you say, yes, this is my business and it's worth 20 million, or I want 20 million for it, and the advisor goes, that sounds great, happy to work on that, and we start the ball rolling, and actually there's no way it's going to stack up to 20 million, everyone's got some sunk costs there, and you're misaligned right from the off. So having those early stage conversations, sharing a little bit of information, it doesn't need to be sort of sort of full deep dive kind of thing. But making sure that valuation expectations are aligned with what the market is saying is a good starting point. Ultimately, a business is worth what someone will pay for it and what the seller is willing to accept. But you need to have those kind of in the same ballpark, at least as a starting point, rather than miles apart.
That's true. And I guess if you have that conversation and there isn't a misalignment, if you want 20 and the reality is it's probably only worth 10 at the moment, that opens up the opportunity to take some steps to address that gap. So you might want to go and do some acquisitions of your own, or look at your cost base, whether your financial engineering is right, to get the business into the place to achieve the financial objective you need to.
Very much so. And another reason why it's really important to start those conversations early. If you sort of suddenly come to an advisor and go, right, I want to sell my business and I want to sell it now, I want to have sold it within 6 months, the cards you are playing are very different to if you have that conversation, say 3 years earlier, and go, this is what I'm seeking to achieve, this is my likely time frame, there's flex in it, but how do we optimize the solution? And that's really what we do. We are trying to create an optimized solution. It's not necessarily highest value. Very often the highest bid is not the best bid, but it's about what does that achieve for that entrepreneur. And it's important to include wealth managers in that conversation, particularly if entrepreneurs are looking to realize a substantial amount of cash. And it can be substantial, whether it's 1 million, 5 million, 10 million, whatever. That's still a lot of cash. And you need to have people on board to say, okay, what would this look like for you as a longer term play? What's your lifestyle? What are your financial needs going forward? Because again, to come back to that, well, I want 20 million, but it's only worth 10, and that's not going to give me enough to live on for 30, 40 years. How do we bridge that gap? What might we do to improve the performance, improve the profitability, so that we can close that gap a little bit?
Yeah, and I definitely echo what you say about wealth advisors being brought in at an early stage. I've seen a number of clients over the years who've been really competent businessmen and businesswomen in their trading businesses, which they've sold for amounts of money which would make me very happy for the rest of my life. But they have then felt that because they were competent in trading businesses, they're able to be property developers, say, or lenders, and have lost really substantial and sometimes even all of those sale proceeds through investments in areas that they don't really understand. So having a wealth advisor who can structure something which gives you some comfort and as much certainty as you can have in the long term, and then putting something aside to experiment with those areas if you want to, knowing you're financially secure, is crucially important. So I would definitely agree with that.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think a lot of M&A advisors have the reputation for being quite narrow-minded or narrowly focused on the deal. And that's true. That's our bread and butter. But it shouldn't be to the exclusion of exploring that broader perspective. Another question I ask very early on is, do you have a will? And it's remarkable how often they go either no, God forbid, or oh yeah, but I don't think I've looked at it or done anything with it for probably 20 years. And it's really important to make sure that all of that life admin and that longer term horizon is part of that early conversation. It's not just about what's the profitability of the business, have you had any offers, can we sell it in 6 to 12 months? That's one small part of it. The handover period, that longer term extraction and transition from entrepreneur and ruler of your own universe to being extracted from that business. And it comes back to, okay, rationalize that why. Do you have a purpose that takes you beyond that? I'm not going to go deeply into sort of someone's individual purpose in life, but it's still important to think about it more holistically.
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely don't want to be at the end of the deal and wondering what next. You need to have some plans and some sense as to what you're going to do. So we've been through the process. People have got to a realistic valuation. They understand what they're trying to achieve. They've thought about the future. They've taken steps perhaps to rejig the shareholdings, perhaps give some shares to their children, something like that prior to the exit. That's great. In terms of the business itself, are there any steps people should be taking internally before the sale process kind of properly gets going?
Very much so. And the more you can front end load the preparation phases, the better. Uh, Due diligence can be an incredibly time consuming period, huge amounts of information required, explanations, and so on. If you can front end load a lot of that work, it does ease things when you get into that part of the process. So, as lead advisors, we clearly need a lot of information front in order to prepare the information memorandum, which is the key marketing document for taking a business to market. So we'll be asking all sorts of questions about the history, the ownership, the operations, the team, the financials, of course. But that barely scratches the surface in terms of the due diligence that a buyer will do, which will cover mainly legal aspects, which is where you guys get involved and doing all the legal side of things, commercial, tax, financial. We project manage all of those work streams, and particularly on the financial, we can coordinate the collation of information, a proper qualitative review of it. Is it fit for purpose? Does it actually give the information that's needed? But you're looking to put together a data pack within a data room that the moment you've got a buyer who you're happy to sign heads of terms with, you can deliver a good tranche of information straight off the bat, knowing that that will cover, even if it's 60% of what their due diligence will be, that gets you way on the front foot. Otherwise, you sign heads of terms, go, marvellous, off we go, we're into legal process. They've promised they can do us a deal within 8 weeks. The buyer sends through a 20-page due diligence questionnaire, and you as an entrepreneur or your management team go, oh dear God, how the hell are we going to cope with this? We're still trying to do the day job. And of course, it's vitally important to try and maintain performance of the business through that diligence period. So it sits on top of the day job and can be so intensive and consuming. If you can front end load a lot of that preparatory work and pulling together that information, instead of receiving 20 pages and thinking, God, how do we do this? We deliver an upfront data room that is populated with a significant proportion of information we know they'll need. And then we say, come back with your further inquiries, deal with this first, then let us know what else you need.
Absolutely. I think a couple of things that I would add to that are first of all, because due diligence is onerous in itself, one of the things you have to consider is which members of your team are you going to bring into the circle? Because if, as a seller, you don't want to tell your senior management team that you're thinking about selling for perfectly understandable reasons of not disrupting things, well, for something that might not happen or might not happen for a little while, trying to do it all yourself, it's a killer, a real nightmare. So
it's an important conversation to have.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
If you can give yourself more time, it's easier. And the other thing is, if you do the exercise and ask yourself the question as you're going along, if I was a buyer, would this be an issue for me? It gives you the chance to correct issues before they become a problem in the transaction. And you can present a solution which the buyer might just say okay to, rather than getting involved in the negotiation with them. So something I have on the transaction at the moment, which is slightly unusual, is the business, one of its properties, which is quite significant to the business, it occupies on a handshake with a mate of the owner. There is no lease or license or anything else. And I know that's going to be an issue we're going to have to fix in the transaction, which we could perhaps have done much more easily and without potentially setting horses running with the buyer if we'd known about it before heads of terms were entered into.
And I think that's another reason why, again, it's important to create a deal team early on, so that all these aspects are thought of with sufficient forethought around all these different aspects. So the wealth management, in terms of what does good look like in terms of how much cash we'd want on day one or value overall. The lawyers, in terms of doing that sense check of all those legal aspects, employment contracts, customer contracts, terms and conditions, and compliance with GDPR on the website. Real estate, is everything there and as it should be, as well as the financial. Let's uncover potential skeletons in the closet now, deal with them, front end load it. Exactly as you say, we can then present a solution rather than being put on the back foot.
And with the financials, of course, it's not just the skeletons. It's also looking to see what the lifestyle costs and that kind of thing that are in there, or perhaps the remuneration you're paying to a seller that might be a bit higher than market rate, which you can then adjust for when you're determining the profit, and therefore your multiple, whatever it is, gets applied to a higher profit, and you get more money at the end of the day. So it's a positive process as well.
Absolutely. Adjustments to EBITDA are a vitally important aspect of our role, making sure that we are presenting something that is sustainable. So we won't add back costs that just because they're paid to a seller, they won't feature in the future. You have to look at replacement costs as well. It's a give and take. But ultimately, we're looking to get to a point where we can defend strongly the underlying profitability and that sustainable level of profitability for the target company. That supports so much that then through due diligence, you are likely or less likely to have price chips coming at you. That's really important. The other aspect of that financial side is looking at the debt-free, cash-free adjustments and normalization of working capital. So again, the more information we have up front, we can work through what that looks like. So sellers' expectations are clear rather than that suddenly being a shock. You get an offer that says an EV of enterprise value of 10 million. Then they say, well, hang on, we're being shown a funds flow that shows a £2 million deduction. We're only getting 8. That doesn't work for me. Again, it needs to happen as part of those earlier stage value expectation conversations. What is the cash in the business? What is the debt position? What's the working capital cycle? And there's a huge amount of education involved in that. So again, front end load it, and you've got an entrepreneur who has a far clearer picture of what they're likely to get at the end.
Absolutely. And having the right team for that, as you alluded before, is absolutely key. What should entrepreneurs be thinking about when they are looking to appoint their team, whether it's corporate finance, lawyers, the IFAs, or other members?
The critical word here is team. Everyone's got to come into this knowing that they're all working together and pulling together in the same direction. So the fit is really important. For us, it's vital that we build a rapport very quickly with our clients. We're going to be asking them to share everything about the business, and they're likely to share far more about the journey that they've been on and where they want to go to next. Emotions run high in these transactions, particularly where you've an entrepreneur who has taken a business from inception through to the point where it's a really attractive target to a broad range of buyers. There's a huge emotional piece in terms of letting go. Clearly, if we start those conversations early enough, it's a good way to start stepping back. Ideally, the entrepreneur wants to make themselves redundant by the time they're looking to sell. If they are still critical to the business, can impact value. Having that team and that fit of advisors around you can't be underestimated. Accountants, tax advisors, lawyers, wealth managers, lead advisory. It sounds like a lot. It's likely that you've never paid fees of this level before. Think of the value that you're looking to realise and the level of expertise that's needed. The legal part of a transaction, from heads of terms through to completion, these days that time frame has become extended. Go back to the beginning of my career and you might get something done from heads to close in 6 or 8 weeks. These days, if you get it done in 10 to 12 weeks, you're doing really well. And that's not for want of not trying to keep it efficient. It's just the complexity of the landscape has grown so much. So the lawyers are having to deal with a huge arena, and you know this, of very complex technical aspects, which are potential risks to a seller, particularly when you come to disclosure and the warranties. So making sure that the legal team has got the bandwidth and the expertise to deal with this. We've had it before where, oh yeah, that's fine, my lawyer can help me with this. I've known him for 30 years. He's done my will, my house sale, and so on. And I do just think you need a good corporate team. You've got to have the employment aspect, the real estate aspect, possibly banking and finance law, as well as the corporate. And it's so worthwhile getting a strong team around. because not having the strongest team can just make everything drag. And the execution risk at that point increases massively. Sorry, I'm not trying to pick on the lawyers here, John. It's the same with accountants. If they can't deal with a tax covenant, the tax warranties, the accounting warranties, given their knowledge and background of having supported the business for a number of years, you need that level of expertise. And it doesn't mean that you're abandoning someone who's been your mate for 20 years. It means you're optimizing your outcome for one transaction. You only get one shot at it.
And I think that's a priority. I have seen lots of transactions over the years where people have appointed perhaps a local firm of solicitors who aren't experienced in doing transactions of the kind that you and I deal with. And they then beat those local solicitors up on price because it's a big number compared to, say, a conveyancing transaction. And what they end up with is an inexperienced team who don't have the budget to do the job properly, end up trying to push things off onto the other side. And what you get is a transaction which is infinitely more painful and time consuming and difficult, and a worse result at the end of the day, because with the best will in the world, a lot of this stuff is quite technical, and you end up taking risks that you don't appreciate that you're taking. And if you're taking a risk and you know you are, then that's fine. That's just a commercial deal. But if you find yourself in trouble because of something you didn't understand you were getting into, or even worse, if you haven't appointed the right lead advisory team and your earnout calculation doesn't produce the result you expected because the proper modelling wasn't put in place, then that's a disaster.
Very much so. The potential pitfalls of not having an experienced team around you can be really quite big. So yeah. Yes. So it sounds self-serving for us to talk about it like we are. But actually, we've seen the upshots of where there isn't the strength in that deal team, and it has such a big impact. It really does. So, yes, I think you and I both know exactly what we're talking about there.
Yeah. So I think it's the summary in this would be don't just look at the number on the bottom line. Think very hard as well about the expertise and size of the team that you're getting involved in. Can they really do the deal that you want to do in the time you want to do it? And them as individuals and their approaches. Different teams have very different styles and very different approaches. I work with a lot of entrepreneurs. I try to take a friendly approach and always be available to them and work as hard as I can to make sure they understand what they're getting into. Other teams are much more brusque. They're perhaps much more technically focused rather than focused on the commercial issues. And for some people in some transactions, that is absolutely the right thing. It's you've got to find the right team for you and what you want to achieve and how you like to do business.
And I think the other aspect of that is it's not just how any one of your team would interact with yourself as the seller. How are they going to interact with the teams acting for a sophisticated corporate buyer or private equity buyer? We've got to be able to bridge that gap. You've got to be able to stand up to price chip attempts or cheeky negotiation tactics that might come from the other side and have the experience to withstand that and defend your client's position. It's one of the strongest parts of the role that we can play is be a buffer between seller and acquirer of whatever nature. If a seller gets bombarded by these questions all the time and these price chips and they don't fully understand, they don't have the advisory team around to support, they can feel absolutely browbeaten, and it can really damage that relationship between the principals. As lead advisor, we can be a buffer for that. We can take some of the punches. We can play bad cop when we need to. Ultimately, our intention is that we get to completion with the principals still really pleased with the deal that they've done. They're shaking hands, looking each other in the eye and going, this is the right thing.
Absolutely, particularly if it's an ongoing transaction, and so there will be a future relationship. It's not just shaking hands and walking away. That's critically important.
Very much so.
Well, thank you very much for that, Victoria. I thought that was really interesting. I really enjoyed it and hopefully useful for our listeners. Obviously, anybody who is thinking about selling their business and are in Victoria's kind of space of a £1 to £10 million profit, or larger, I'm sure would be fine as well. Please do reach out to her. Victoria and her team are great at helping people prepare for sale and then leading them through the sale process on the lead advisory side. So, Victoria, thanks again for joining me on the podcast. It's been great having you.
John, it's been lovely to see you.